Hey, welcome to another episode of the WP Crowd. Today we have actually two new guests and a returning WP Crowd member. We're talking about something unusual today, PHP. So weird. But before we get started, I'm going to do introductions as always. So I'm going to go ahead and start out with Austin. Go ahead and introduce yourself. What do you do? Stuff like that.
How's it going? My name's Austin Passy, and a lot of people on the internet know me as the Frosty. I'm a WordPress developer and been working on WordPress for close to 10 years, and right now looking for my next big gig. Just left Enterprise that I was at for the last couple of years.
Nice. All right, David, why don't you go next?
Sure. I am David. Most probably you might recognize me from my face being on WP Shout all the time. If you recognize me at all, I do a lot of WordPress and other PHP Framework development as client services, kind of independently. The company is called PressUp, but you've never heard of that, so.
We have now.
It's true.
And our tens of viewers are now going to know. And Chris.
Chris Flanagan. I am a developer for FlowPress, Toronto, Canada. That I am down here in Sarasota, Florida. I am their token American developer, they like to say. I do WordPress things, plugins, themes, just whatever people want to do with WordPress, and experiment quite a bit with PHP.
So just out of a tangential question for you, Chris, you get complaints that they hired someone south of the border to take one of their jobs away from one of their perfectly eligible citizens.
They have all sorts of jokes, but the fact is we're actually trying to hire 2 more senior developers right now, and it's hard to find quality people out there. So they'd hire more Americans. They would. If you're watching this one on Fly, hit us up.
All right. So I'm going to start with the question of, let's just figure out what PHP frameworks we've all worked with and which ones you guys like. I'm going to start off this conversation with an old school PHP framework that I think is still around. I haven't played around with it in a long time, but I've actually had a full-time job catering just to it, which is Cake PHP. Cake's been around for quite a while. It was probably the first MVC framework I ever learned outside, well, period, almost. And I always liked the way that Cake does its baking process, and it really allowed me to get up and running with a lot of PHP stuff very quickly. So yeah, I'm gonna put Cake out there. Curious what you guys have been working with. Just go ahead and name off whatever you work with, and if you liked working with it.
Sure, I can go first. So the first MVC PHP framework I used was like Laravel 3 a couple years ago, and it's had a couple like backwards and compatible upgrades since then, which has been a little more painful than I wanted for like the toy app that I built out with it initially. And I've used it in a couple other projects. I generally like Laravel, although Active Record is. To get very technical, Active Record isn't my favorite like way of thinking about a database. So I actually prefer and have most recently been building out a client project with Symphony. And I would say that Symphony on the whole is more to my liking. It's much more conservative in the way they deprecate and add features. It does kind of do some architecture astronaut-y things, which are maybe overwhelming, but I generally find it's more compatible with what I like than Laravel is. Although I still like, no disrespect to Laravel, I like it very well.
Yeah, I do want to get back to the Symphony and Laravel thing, because those are like the 2 big players right now in the PHP world. Austin, have you played with anything else, or have you played with one of those 2?
I was just going to mention Symphony. Symphony 3 to be specific. Well, most of my work though actually is not on a separate application layer. It's integrating Symphony 3 into WordPress. So there's some fun stuff there.
Yeah, I do want to come back to that, but first, Chris, how about you? Anything any other frameworks that you might have played with, or do you have any ones that have already been mentioned that you like?
You know, Roy, I didn't warn you about this, but I've never used any frameworks, so I'm here more to throw a wrench in the conversation and talk about some of the applications I built just from scratch in raw PHP and why I think that's the best method for some situations.
Ooh,
I like that. Sometimes maybe
a wild card.
Yeah, maybe sometimes a framework is overkill.
No, don't get me wrong. I want to learn Laravel. I do. I've heard nothing but amazing things about it. It's just finding the time. When I work on WordPress all day, and then I have some side projects that I'd rather just get done than try to learn a whole framework. And there's no pitch. It's not like I'm building a whole CMS or anything. So it's like, why do I need a framework at some point?
Well, because it's part of the process of learning. I mean, like it's a rite of passage. You have to roll your own framework at some point or another.
Yeah.
It's true. It's next on the list.
All right. So Symphony and Laravel. So Symphony and Laravel are the two biggest players, I think, out there right now. I haven't played around with Laravel in quite a while, and I have never played around with Symphony outside of, dare I say, a little bit of Drupal work, because I know the new Drupal was built on Symphony. So I did
Symphony
a little research. Yeah, I've done some research and gone that route a little bit, but I haven't played with Laravel since I think 3. So yeah, it's been quite a while.
Yeah, it's pretty different now.
But our good friend Josh Pollock, who is typically a API connoisseur, loves Laravel or Laravel, whatever you want to, however it's pronounced.
Laravel.
Yeah. So I'm curious, David, how you've been playing around with it, and actually, no, you said you like Symphony, and Austin.
I prefer Symphony, but I've fiddled with Laravel a fair amount and have done multiple client projects. So,
do you think Symphony is an easier step up when coming out of WordPress?
No. The basic very nice thing about Laravel is that I would say that it is the most commonly used one, and there is a very amazing site that everyone I know who likes Laravel knows about called Laracasts, which is Jeffrey Way is just this very, very good teacher of Laravel, and for something absurd like $9 a month, you get an unlimited subscription to just utterly vast, huge, great set of tutorials for development for it. And there isn't anything that's exactly comparable in Symphony. And the other thing is Symphony is more enterprisey in every conceivable way. Configuration is like, oh, maybe you want to use XML. As a WordPress developer, I don't think you're probably going to have done XML writing in a long time, if ever. Or YAML, which is, again, great in some ways, but different enough that I think Laravel is easier because it's got more Stack Overflow answers, and it's also a little more pragmatic about the way it thinks about a lot of this stuff than Symphony has a tendency to be.
So Austin, you've also kind of dabbled in both, but you said Symphony's more what you played around more with. So
I actually haven't done too much Laravel stuff, but I'm actually interested, and I've been following along with some of those tutorials online and looking at some code and playing around, and started to follow a lot of the Laravel developers on GitHub and on Twitter. So I'm definitely watching a lot more in the interaction, mainly because I'm seeing them force minimum PHP 7 version restrictions in their upcoming releases, like 7.1 or whatever. I actually forget the version of Laravel, but that kind of stuff kind of interests me. But the last 2 years, enterprise, as David mentioned, we went with Symphony, and you will find a lot of documentation or examples and Stack Overflow stuff for Laravel, but you won't find it for the newer version of Symphony. You find a lot for Symphony 2, but again, David mentioned earlier that they broke a lot, or a lot changed from Symphony 2 to Symphony 3. So
Yeah,
they'd figure it all out on the fly.
I would actually say, based on my experience, which is not complete, but Laravel 4 to 5 was a more complicated jump, if I recall correctly, to like port over than Symphony 2 to 3. Because Symphony really is like, Symphony is the most like enterprise compatible, like they have a very clear deprecation schedule for how they will deprecate things in the future. And I actually have an app, the app I have right now is still on Symphony 2.8, but I also know that once I get rid of like 3 deprecation warnings, I could put it on Symphony 3.2, like now. So I actually think Symphony is more stable in that way. Although most of the Laravel point releases I think are compatible now, because both Symphony and Laravel do SEMVer, which stands for semantic versioning, and it means that if they don't bump the big number, you're going to have more compatibility. I do think Taylor Otwell, who's basically the sole author of Laravel, which is a little ungenerous to the community, but who is the primary guy who just like writes Laravel, he's been kind of gung-ho about deprecating things and deleting them, much more so than Symphony as a ecosystem is. And that's, I think, one of the big trade-offs. I think he's been a little more intentional recently about when and how he deprecates things, and he does have like an LTS version of Laravel, but compared to Symphony with the like giant slow process, it's somewhat more like the chaos of JavaScript, for example.
So what would you say the 2 use cases are? Like where does the Symphony like bread and butter, and where's Laravel's bread and butter? Like coming out of the WordPress world, we expect almost an install, and granted, you have to know that WordPress is a CMS, so you're going to get the CMS, and you're not going to get that out of a install of Laravel or Symphony. Yeah. What are each of those best used or served for to build with, or to, yeah, that question made any sense at all?
It did. Yeah. It did. I feel like I'm kind of dominating, so if anyone wants to address that first.
I think that Symphony is mainly used and most popular in enterprise, and also because it's tight coupling with database management, so it can be used for microservice creation outside of these mini apps, which are taking off and super popular right now. Everyone wants some sort of microservice, small things that do one task and one task very well.
Yeah.
So you just don't get a lot of the overhead that you would with Laravel? Like Laravel gives you a lot more out of the box, you would say?
That I actually can't compare enough, because I haven't gone into full development with Laravel, so I don't want to mention anything that I don't have knowledge in.
Sure.
But I mean, from what I've read, I think it could be done on the same level. Also, without going all the way into the code and everything, from what I can see, Laravel reads a lot easier than Symphony does. Meaning like the way the code is written, it's more human readable to me than Symphony is.
Yeah. I think that is a really good point, and that's another reason that I think Laravel is probably easier to learn, is you don't have to really understand, the dependency injection container that the framework provides, which is a necessary thing to really get into Symphony development. I think in general, I'd say that they're aimed at the same thing. Both Symphony and Laravel, in various ways, have like a lighter version of their framework, which is made for like a 1 to 10 page app kind of thing, where like if you just want an API or something, the Symphony one, which I don't hear as much about anymore, is called Silex, SILEX.
Yeah,
and then the Laravel has a thing called Lumen, I believe it was called, which is a similar sort of like micro framework. So for like very small apps, maybe somewhat in the way that Chris is thinking, like those are nice because they provide you basic like routing, URL stuff without having to deal with anything else. But like they prevent you from doing like the htaccess routing that I've done in pure PHP apps before. But in general, I would say that the big difference is that people in large companies forced to make this decision prefer Symphony for the long deprecation schedule and the promise of this is our support schedule where 3 years later you can still be on X version of Symphony and it'll be fine. And Laravel is starting to have that kind of stuff, but hasn't historically. So I think that's one of the big trade-offs. The other thing is that Laravel's database system is called Active Record and is a little simpler, but also a little harder to use against a brownfield application, an older application where you need to like import various things into, because there's a very tight coupling in the Active Record design pattern to the database and your application. So I think Laravel is generally a little better at like rapid prototyping of something, but if I was gonna have to support something for 10 years, I would always pick Symphony and the Doctrine ORM that it uses instead, because it's a little more flexible in some sense. It's a little more enterprisey as well, but it's also more powerful and abstracted than the Laravel one is. So that's why I would pick Laravel for quick prototyping, but I wouldn't necessarily want to like port an old app into it, where I might be more comfortable doing that with Symphony.
Yeah, I can understand the enterprise realm. Like that's one of the, I mean, we've talked about it on the show in past episodes and definitely talked to many people about it at WordCamps and stuff. It's the same reason why WordPress isn't kind of as popular in the enterprise realm, because it doesn't have the LTS strategy. It doesn't have, these long nothing's really deprecating. It's all backwards compatible, but at the same time, there's updates every, 2 weeks. Right?
Yeah, the actual WordPress solution to that problem is just like, oh yeah, WordPress is always compatible, which isn't fully true as we know from experience, but that is, I think, I feel like that's WordPress's institutional answer.
I actually found that WordPress, for the most part, has been backwards compatible up until maybe 4.6. Was it 4.6 that the requests API went in? The HTTP API switched to request?
Yeah, I think so.
4.6. That broke. That had some backwards compatible breaking changes.
I also got hacked really bad. Like really bad.
Well, that was 4.7 was when the REST API.
4.7. Well, it's still when the REST API in there.
But when they switched, I think 4.6, when they put in the requests class merged into the HTTP API, it had some return types and some of the responses from default, WP remote get. So you're expecting an array, it was getting an object, some new class object, which you weren't checking for. You would break some stuff. But for the most part, most people know that WordPress doesn't follow the semantic versioning, and version 3.9 is exactly the same as 4.0, just some new features. So
version 3.9 is version 39 of WordPress.
Right, but people get confused, like, oh, version 4, that must be a complete rewrite or something different from 3.9. Well, no, not really. It's just the next version in line. They don't go to 10, they don't go to 11, and so on and so forth.
I think that point is really interesting, right? Though, that like if WordPress had like a page that was like, this is our LTS period and this is our commitment to deprecation and stuff, I wonder how much easier it would be to sell in some of those enterprise environments that want to see a page like that, of like, this is how long we support a thing. Because like basically WordPress's answer is like, well, from 3.7 forward, we backport most security fixes.
Well, they do, right? So you can go to version, let's just go back to version 3. That's the biggest last major change. When multi-site was merged in. I think the latest version, I'd have to look up exactly, but we're probably on 3.0.21. Technically, they push out like any vulnerabilities. I don't want to pull it up real fast, but like the 3.1, 3.2, all those, if you look back and download old versions, they're like the point releases jumped up like 12, 13, 14, 18 numbers, because they do security releases for older versions. I'm not sure how far back they do it, but maybe they do it all the way back to 2.3. I don't know. We can take
but
a
it's
look.
not formalized. I feel like it's not formally stated anywhere in the way that you
definitely not.
Yeah, your project manager at IBM needs it to be.
Right. They want to say like the next version, when version 5 comes out, this is version 5 LTS, and they're like, oh, sweet.
Yeah.
Technically, if you stay on it, you just turn on auto updates. You can turn on auto, whatever the bug fix release. You don't get to 5.1, but you go to 5.0.2, 5.0.3, etc.
So I want to talk quickly to you about integration with WordPress. So I can talk all day about integrating JavaScript frameworks with WordPress. I can't talk to you for 2 minutes about PHP integration with WordPress.
Sure.
So I'm curious what use cases there are and why someone would want to integrate Symphony. Like, why wouldn't they build whatever it is you built in Symphony in WordPress versus building it in Symphony? And what is it that's integrating into WordPress?
Sure. So I spent the last 2 years working with Symphony and WordPress, and one of the good things about Symphony is it's all module based. So you can take the whole Symphony framework and you can break it into chunks, and then you can use the whole thing, or you can just use parts. So since we were using WordPress as the full CMS framework, we didn't need the whole Symphony framework. So we just chose parts, and basically we were using, for the most part, the HTTP foundation, which has, and then the dependency injection. One of the main reasons is dependency injection. So in the last project that I was working on over at Beachbody, we had dependency injection into our application, basically so that our plugins can auto-load everything from Composer, but then we would auto-wire up classes that we need to be passed around here and there between other classes within the plugin or within the theme or the whole application layer. That's
so you're using Symphony as mainly like an injection service, like not really like adding functionality for, let's say, end user experience, but just for development, basically.
Correct. So end user never noticed any difference whether it was WordPress or not. Now we did switch. One of our applications was strictly WordPress interactions, and then we switched to our last application, which was WordPress with Symphony behind it and a microservice running on a Java layer. So there was some back and forth there where we were separating out WordPress users. No longer in the new application we were using a microservice users. But Symphony also has HTTP, kind of like what everyone's familiar with, the WP API, so WP remote get, post, etc. response. We were using some of the Symphony calls and classes to make calls to our API via the PHP layer. And some of them were even wrappers inside the WordPress HTTPI when we needed to pass through WordPress. So it got a little complex there.
It seems like that would like introduce more risk than anything, like, because WordPress it's not built to work with a framework like that. So I don't know, that would I'm just like, what's the WordPress layer even there for? Is it because you're building plugins that you want to just work on any WordPress install?
Yeah, so it definitely got a little complex, and the WordPress layer was there because we needed CMS, and it was the CMS of choice, and since we were coming over from we're actually building an application version 2, so we were porting over from previous where we had blog posts running through. So the WordPress was there as the PHP layer integration with Symphony, where WordPress was still doing our routing and our CMS and our admin and our posts. But Symphony was in the back end passing in code that was easier to develop in, where we weren't making calls for global variables, or we weren't making calls to the global requests or get or posts or the global server variables. So everything was passed in from the container, Symphony's container, and then passed into dependency injection and whatnot.
So at that point, is someone viewing the app? Are they viewing a WordPress output, or did you transfer it to Symphony?
They are viewing WordPress.
So
WordPress was still handling WordPress. So it was still bootstrapping WordPress the not so semi-normal way, but the normal way. We went through Roots and Bedrock. So everything was routed into WordPress index file and bootstrapping it that way. But the code that was auto wiring up all of our classes and interactions and API calls in the backend were either using Symphony.
The Symphony stuff was just like pulled in via shortcode or something?
Symphony, all the Symphony stuff was written in custom classes within our main instance plugin. That was kind of.
But what was the linkage? Were certain WordPress pages just routing to a Symphony app, or
no. So Symphony did not do any CMS or management or routing. We were just using. I'd have to find an example in the code, but it was you're basically using the HTTP Foundation, dependency injection, and a few other of components or modules within the Symphony framework. I don't remember offhand which ones they were.
So instead of having like a big class or a cluster of classes in a plugin, you'd actually have that separated out in like a Symphony application, and then
yes,
like your plugin.
So if you ever look into like the documentation of the Symphony dependency injection, which is quite a behemoth, and so there's Symphony documentation you can get lost in and get a little confused. A lot of plugins, some big plugins that are out there, WordPress plugins. You will see that you can go into them. You can see like a class that might require some other class, basically instantiates a new version, or they're using a singleton pattern where you have a class and you just get an instance of it and you're calling that instance in like 30 different places. Well, we just chose to go a certain route in our coding standards. We're in PHP 7 minimum, and we had restrictions on like we didn't want to have globals populated everywhere. We didn't want to call this class multiple times or have singletons everywhere. So it was kind of a discussion we had at the very beginning when we were developing the idea for the version 2 of this application and how we were going to build it. And so one of our other developers suggested Symphony for dependency injection and the HTTP Foundation, which would basically handle global, like I mentioned earlier, global posts and gets and server variables. So we can pass that around, basically pass that from the plugin, whatever the plugin needs to do. The plugin handled checkout, the plugin handled integration with other plugins, the plugin handled short code creations, cron management, Ajax calls, like what a regular plugin would do, what you're familiar with any WordPress plugin. We just had from the backend code coming from different layers.
It's an interesting setup. Super complex and definitely not a typical WordPress. Like, would not recommend for someone who just wants a blog.
No, definitely not.
But I think I understand, like, you know, I work in enterprise, so I understand like the importance of not just modularity, but performant code, and especially when you're dealing with, you know, microservices and small, high functional pieces of code. And I could understand where having that decoupled from WordPress, but then having WordPress be able to communicate with it is good, or where that would really come in handy. I feel like nowadays the generation exists where you would do that same thing, except now you build an API for whatever it is you want to do, right? Like you do the same thing you just did, except you make an API on the front end of it, so WordPress can communicate with that API. Versus trying to integrate, classes and stuff, which I guess, it reduces an HTTP request, so it could be more performant that way, depending how, coupled in that functionality is. But I think, I don't know, for people who want to come out of WordPress, there's definitely a few more options. There are other PHP frameworks out there. I'm sorry that we've kind of been limiting ourselves to two, but those are the two big ones. Kind of like if this was a JavaScript conversation, we'd probably only be talking about Angular and React. You can't, you could talk about all the other ones, but there's no point. Same with Laravel and
Ember and Vue are terrible. Don't use them. Yeah.
It's not that they're terrible. It's just like there's like it's not point. There are other PHP frameworks that I actually would like to get into.
Yeah, I've never tried Zend. That seems like the biggest framework we haven't talked about in PHP.
Well, Zend is the
Zend framework.
Zend is like the grandmaster PHP framework. It's been around, I want to say, since like PHP was introduced to the world. And it's been iterated upon so many times. I've actually played around with Zend quite a few times, not from scratch, but actually looking at Zend builds and modifying them. Super complicated. Like, that's why I liked Cake, because when I went into Cake, I was like, this is way easier. It actually has build tools and stuff built into it, not, very, very rudimentary MVC framework. There was another one I'd also like, to point out, which is Falcon, which is, I've heard really good things about it. It's the
coolest name of all of them.
Yeah, it's PH Falcon, so Falcon with like
that's really cool.
Yeah, it's
pick it up a notch.
Yeah, that marketing team is on point. But that was one I really wanted to play around with for quite a while. And honestly, like, because I'm mainly a front end developer, I've been looking for, and I'm happy David mentioned these, but really looking forward to play around with PHP frameworks that only build out APIs, as opposed to, hey, I don't need the view layer. I don't really need, I need a minimal controller layer. I need something that I can quickly get up and running and have an API framework, a RESTful API. If you guys have played around with Node, Sales.js is what I compare that to. Sales.js, you like tell it, hey, I want a new model stack, and it'll create the whole stack for you, model, controller, and a view layer, as well as a RESTful API to go along with it. So all of a sudden you have app/like users with a full CRUD able URL endpoint. So looking for something similar with PHP, since I know PHP well enough to be dangerous, even semi-good. But I'm posing the question for everybody else who's going to watch the video. What are you playing around with, and what have you jumped to from WordPress? So I'm going to call it there.
Wow, I was worthless on that one, Roy. I think I jumped into the wrong topic.
Yeah, I'm happy for your input, Chris.
Yeah, I was really talkative.
Well, at least you learned something.
Yeah, I did.
How to make a complex integration with the PHP framework into WordPress.
Yeah, I guess I don't know. It's I haven't had the use case for that, I guess, is why I haven't really jumped into it. It's like I've built I've built my own routing system, or I've built my own database layers and stuff, but it's just, that's all I needed. I didn't need a whole framework. So I was like, why not just build it like I have in mind? I just hadn't really been hit with a project where I need a big PHP framework like that.
Well, I would I'd agree with your approach. Like, that's why I asked Austin why he built what he did. Like, as he was talking, I was like, why don't you just build this into a plugin? Like, it doesn't make any sense.
Because enterprise. That's why.
Enterprise. So,
but like, yeah, when you talk about advanced PHP, you're talking about building advanced plugins, or parts of plugins, or some crazy plugin. You don't think, oh, let's just break this off into a separate framework and have the framework handle this, even if it's on a microservice, like whatever service it is, have it handle that, and then have a plugin just communicate with it. It's an interesting thought. I'm more, you know, I don't have the use case for it either yet. So I'm more on the lines of build it into WordPress. It'll handle it. Cool. So just to wrap up really quick, if you are watching on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below somewhere. If you're listening, make sure to go to YouTube and then hit subscribe down below somewhere. Or subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Google Play. Also, check out calderalearn.com. Josh Pollock and Royce Yvonne, that's me, doing tutorials, recorded courses, and we're going to start our first live webinar series. So basically learn live with homework and accountability. It's going to be cool. I'm going to have a lot of fun with it. But that's going to start up pretty soon. So check out calderalearn.com. We also have some free videos on there. So until next week, I will see you guys later.